My name's Gary Biltcliffe. I'm an independent researcher of sacred sites and megalithic sites around Europe and the world. I've travelled since I was a teenager because I'm fascinating in sacred sites and megalithic sites. So this has taken me around to some amazing cities around the world in South America, most of Europe and Australasia.
What's your view on why the ancients went to such trouble to build these monuments?
I think some of the greatest walled cities that we discovered were actually built more to contain a site rather than defence or warfare. And I think it has something to do with a sacred way of enhancing a site, because some of these walled cities were actually previously ceremonial sites. Rather than, it's like the hill forts in Britain, there's no great evidence that they were for warfare or for defence, because very few weapons have been found inside them. In fact, more ceremonial ritual objects have been found, which indicates a sacred usage.
Indeed. Why do you think they have such a profound effect on people today, these places?
I think the sheer miracle of the stonework and the way it's put together affects people. It's the size of the stone, the weight. It's as if another culture from another time, with more sophisticated than we are, came along. And I think there's an energy that comes from these stones and these sites, and I think the ancient peoples built these cities at certain places of power in the landscape, and they understood the landscape and read it like a book. And certain areas of the landscape are sited towards other distant peaks or shapes or anomalies that give it a power. And I think it's all about finding harmony in the landscape and in the people themselves.
And you think that kind of innate harmony has resonance for modern people too?
I certainly do, because today we live too close together in areas we shouldn't be building. It's in areas that are out of harmony with the surrounding landscape, like floodplains, building in floodplains. Orientation of a building is all wrong these days. It's like the old feng shui thing that a geomancer would be used in ancient times to site your house, to position it correctly, and the right materials it's built from is very important, because stone has an effect upon us too.
So if we were to focus on one or two particular sites that are well known by people, we've talked amongst ourselves about Chichen Itza, we've talked about Stonehenge, obviously, the Giza Pyramids. These are the most iconographic ones, I suppose, or that modern people know about today. Do you feel that those responsible for them were leaving messages for us today?
It's possible they were, but I think these places were built to last. They used the largest stones, and rather like the Mycenaean walls in Greece, they will be there forever, because those stones weighing over 50 tons cannot be moved. They're earthquake-proof. The Polygonal walls are earthquake-proof. It's as if the people in the past built for them to last into maybe, right into the future. And probably, today people are resonating with these sites again, and it's possible that there are messages, subliminal messages in these sites that may trigger off some kind of spiritual awakening.
I'm going to ask you a very personal question, a very subjective question now. Is there a particular site that's your own personal favourite?
Well, I would say probably some of the Cumbrian stone circles, because that area was never poisoned by the Romans and early Christians as much. It stayed in its essence megalithic, and even the people there are still very spiritual. So I resonate with the monuments of that area, because they resonate what it should be giving out.
On a perhaps a more pragmatic note, have you any ideas of your own about how these particular sites were built?
How they were built?
How they're physically put together, yeah.
Well, there's many theories. Some people say there was a time when the Earth was in a situation where its gravity was lessened and the stones were easier to move. There's a theory that they were able to lift the stones and move the stones. We know from the party games of lifting heavy people up with two fingers and using, I've seen that done on stones as well. So, that there are ways that it can be done, but it's why they would actually go to the trouble of cutting large blocks of stone. That's the question. I think because it's something that has to do with resonance and sound, and the larger the blocks the temple is made from, the more resonant it is, and I think it was important for them to use large blocks. And the other theory is maybe these people were just very good at moving, cutting and placing large blocks of stone. They found it easy. The walls of central Italy that we've been uncovering, very few people know they're there because often these are Roman towns and the guidebook says these are Roman walls. But when you look at them, they're massive blocks of masonry that are locked together in the Polygonal method, which is basically several different sized stones at different shapes and different angles all put together and locked together like a jigsaw.
Like at Tiwanaku?
Yeah, it's like at Tiwanaku, exactly. And the walls of central Italy are more like Tiwanaku than any other polygonal walls of Greece, because the polygonal walls of central Italy are larger than the polygonal walls of Greece, and they're more similar to the ones in Peru. But the sheer height of the walls in central Italy, the place called Alatri, has walls over 30 feet high of polygonal masonry, and some of the larger blocks are high up in the wall, which I was told by a stonemason is a way of stabilising the whole thing.
Interesting.
But the stonemason said to me, he says, stone building methods haven't changed much over the years. He said, because in Bosnia, a local man was showing me that the prehistoric walls built by the Illyrians are exactly the same as the walls they're building today. So in over 2,000, probably 3,000 years, their methods of stone building walls haven't changed. But it seems like a certain period of time, somebody came in and built these incredibly large walls. You'd think that, unless these walls are very, 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 very ancient. But if archaeologists can prove these walls are recent, then obviously another race, a far more sophisticated race than the Illyrians, came into their area and built a sacred temple with these great walls around it.
Do you have any thoughts on whether or not the technology responsible for these fantastic buildings was more advanced than we've hitherto given it credit to?
I think obviously. Talking to stonemasons, they say the weight is the problem. Stonemasons can produce polygonal walls, but only as small stones. But it takes a long time. But it's the weight is the problem. Now, obviously, these people had no problem with weight. So I think there's a key to it there. And I've heard, even in Tibet, they can raise great blocks of stone with an orchestra of instruments, But I think maybe, these people also had a way of cutting stone like butter, because the shaping of them is key as well, because the joints are so fine, you can't get a knife through them. There's no error of mistake. That you start your wall building up, your next stone has got to be so accurate to fit in. You can't keep taking a few ton blocks in and out while chipping away. It's almost as if they'd cut out a cliff wall, took it down, and put it back as they'd cut it out.
Why do you think the stars, the sun, the moon, the celestial bodies, why do you think they were so important to the ancients? Because that seems pretty clear too. In almost every ancient and megalithic site that you look at, there seems to be a correlation with the heavens, doesn't there?
And the sun and the moon, of course, and the pole star, which was the only star that stayed stationary in the night sky, night after night. And everything revolves around it, and I've come to see the mystery in that. the ancients, who obviously there was no pollution in those days, and stars were much brighter and nearer to them, and they observed them, religiously, and gave, constellations characters, and maybe they saw that these planets influenced us, like in astrology today. So, yes, I think they would obviously have a belief in life after death as well, and that the heavens were the heavenly realms, if you like. I think it was important for them to honour certain stars through characters, through allegory, and certainly the true north, as we've found in a lot of sites. The true north has a sacred mountain. Even in South America, we always find particular buildings that's a sacred site. There is a particular sacred mountain directly north of there. So positioning was important, with taking into consideration the constellations.
Why do you think the sites were aligned over such vast distances, which again it seems to be emerging as a common feature?
Again, I think this has to do with the sun and solar influences, and it's possible that they also understood that the Earth, there are Earth energies, and that, like I've discovered at stone circles, that eject the energy after a build-up in straight lines. And that spirit paths also said to be in straight lines. That's when the spirit leaves the body, it can only travel straight, according to the ancient traditions. So maybe they saw that they could, maybe through certain monuments, create a communication network of fertility lines, if you like, that will actually benefit the landscape and enhance the harvest, because in those days harvest was the most important. It's a means of survival. So I think a lot was done for producing food, and also regulating the weather, because the weather's got to be right for your harvest. So I think they were able to manipulate the landscape to control the weather as well. And I think certain sites are aligned to each other to certain directions, as we found in Bosnia. Many of the ancient sites and Croatia are aligned to this alignment to the winter solstice sunrise, which was the time when the sun god dies and is born again. So they were honouring the direction of the life energy that will bring them food for the coming year.
Why do you think that orthodox academe and orthodox archaeology are so resistant to new ideas?
Well, they're very rigid about what fits where into history, and they don't really like to have academic books republished or rewritten, and so everything really fits in its place. Really, many years ago, in this country we talked about the Celts as Iberians, and it gave them a name and identity, but archaeology comes along and puts them into categories: Bronze Age, Iron Age, Neolithic Age. So I think archaeology has taken a lot of personality out of the old traditions have sort of been ignored, and everything. Like I said in the lecture, why is it that every king before the Romans came is now a legend? The kings after the Romans are established, known, but before the Romans they are mythical. And it's a way of, it's propaganda. It's a way of taking over a country, subjecting its people. And I think archaeology is behind that, because when archaeologists do find something that's an anomaly, that doesn't fit with science, it's usually, disregarded.
Ignored and sidelined.
Ignored,
yeah.
and placed in cellars around in different museums. And I think the polygonal walls, to them, they have to be Roman because they're very sophisticated. And they can't imagine any other race but the Romans producing them, because to say that these were built by Neolithic people would be against all their ideas of a primitive people who were just primitive farmers and wearing animal skins.
And do you think that this kind of reticence to incorporate new ideas and new findings, which effectively really is anti-science, isn't it? Because if we assume science is the constant assimilation of new information to mould your prevailing ideas, then this is anti-scientific, isn't it?
It is.
To ignore any new information. And do you think that stance is arrogance, ignorance, or something else entirely?
I think all those things. I've met a lot of archaeologists who are rather like doctors, very arrogant. They know what the subject is, and if you speak out about anything that's out of their norm, they're very hostile. And I think they don't have the ability to think outside of the box, and I think a lot of researchers like me are able to sort of think outside of the box and think into different areas. Look at every aspect of a site, not just what fits in chronological order. Because if archaeologists find a buried Britain 300 years in the future and then look at all the bodies, they'll probably say that, well, there was some invasion here from Northern Europeans, because all of a sudden at this period all these people came into the country and there are mass burial sites. But the truth is, that it's like the Saxon invasion. Did they invade, or archaeology is about perspective, and I think we have to, really look at every aspect to see the truth, including folklore. I mean, because we often find folklore has been left for future generations. It's rather like the old memory trick. You exaggerate a story, and it's easily remembered, and often folklore refers to certain aspects of a site, maybe to do with giants or throwing particular stones, and some of them sound ridiculous, but hidden in there in allegory is, the key to the site. And so we never discount folklore, but look at it differently, not as fact, but as an allegory.
I agree entirely, and I think this is a large problem with archaeology as an exact science, if you like, is that it willfully refuses to look at other aspects that might affect the bigger picture. I agree entirely. Why do you think that most archaeology is so rigid in its timeline for ancient monuments? They've got a very fixed idea of when all these things were put together, but mounting evidence seems to suggest a lot of these are significantly older. Why do you think that they stick to this rigid timeline?
Well, again, I think a lot of it's political. I do think that there is certain factions within the world that like to keep things under control, and part of the way of controlling people is to control their history. Because, like the Britons, we're told that we're descended from barbarians. And so having that deep in our psyche, that we were, painted barbarians who were civilized by the great Roman race, made it easier for them to assimilate us. And we look up to them. But they've actually taken away our heritage, because we have an illustrious line of kings going back to the Bronze Age. And it's the same with archaeology. They like to keep this rigid control over history, because it helps in certain countries to keep the population under control and in a way subjected to because if you're very proud of your country and you're very you have a love for it, then you succeed in many things in life. And I think if you are kept under control and in fear, then you'll just work the machine, live in the machine. It's a political thing, I think.
A lot of these sites all over the world are very similar, and whether it be in terms of the construction methods, we talked about Tiwanaku and the places you've been looking at in Italy and Croatia, but also in terms of perhaps their alignments with the heavens and their obvious awareness of astronomy. Why do you think that is?
Well, I think they were far more spiritual than we are today, and they were able to communicate with higher consciousness, with their own higher selves. And I also think that it was easier for them. They were very different to us today, and I think they had great visions and dreams and information. There's far more information going around. And I think they were more sensitive to natural energies as well, and maybe they were understood more about the constellations than we do today, because they weren't in a material world, locked in a material world like we are. They were living, breathing, and out of their own landscape, and they were very in tune with it. I think they knew that what is above is the same in the ground. You know, that there was a mirror of the heavens. They often built their sites to mirror the heavens on the ground.
So an intrinsic acknowledgement of our interconnectedness with all things in the universe.
Absolutely, and I think they had acknowledged that they weren't separate, that they were linked with everything and everybody. Today we believed, and we're experiencing separation at its extreme, but I think, you know, we're coming to a time now where we are turning and rediscovering ourselves and our connection with everybody and everything, including the heavens, the land, animal kingdom.
And do you think there is a place actually where we can take the best of our technological disconnectedness, throw away what we don't need and doesn't do us any good? Can we perhaps look at ways in which we can rediscover our connection with earth energies, and possibly even means of recording these in some fashion? Do you think that's a likelihood for the future?
I really do think that's a likelihood for the future, and I think the first steps have to be made by separating yourself from the material world machine. And I have to say that mobile phones and tetra waves are all part of this effort to reduce our senses, because these waves are very close to our waves of communication and psychic abilities. And I've found my own psychic abilities are lessened since a lot of these masts have been put up. As if, you know, there's like some science fiction film where these controlling towers are put up. And
I don't think you're so very far from the truth, actually. My own instincts have led me in the same direction.
Whereas the microwave energies are not very good for us at all, as you know. Over a long period of time, it does start to make you feel more separated and in fear. So I think the first things we have to do is separate ourselves. And, you know, like the American Indians, if they wanted to reconnect with the land, they would go on a vision quest, and the Aboriginals would go on walkabout. And this is a way of separating themselves from their ordinary lives. And so that you go into an area that's quiet, like in the Scottish mountains or whatever, or the Welsh mountains, or anywhere separate, and be with yourself. Because only then, you know, because often you're with somebody, you're connecting, you're talking, communicating, but when you're on your own and things start to happen, especially out in the landscape, and you start to reconnect with yourself and your emotions and your fears, and also get great ideas and inspirations. And I think that's a beginning, but yeah, there's a long way to go.
Gary Biltcliffe, thank you very much.
Thank you. Megalithomania.